speaker is now ready. So let me introduce him with a few words, then we can get rolling on the second installment of the morning program. My name's Blair from Yale. I'll be the moderator. And Ashutosh Varshney from Brown University will be the speaker. And if the last session generated a little bit of heat and light, we should be able to provide more, this time with the topic of India's democracy, electoral vibrancy and liberal deficits. And India is a good source of both of those things, electoral vibrancy and liberal deficits, so there'll be a lot to talk about. Ashutosh Varshney finished his PhD at MIT, one of the students of Myron Weiner there. Was later a Guggenheim awardee, among many other awards. His first major work was a book called Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life. Came out in 2003. And after much consternation about what could be done about communal riots or the endemic, inevitable in India, he made a good case that there are at least some places in India where previous cooperation in civil society between Hindus and Muslims had a very significant attenuating effect on urban violence. It's become something of a landmark in the study of the subcontinent. He's gone on to do research in Indonesia, in China. He's now involved in a long-term study on providing public service delivery in Indian cities, which is coming to an end, I think, in a year or two, and will result in more publications. So let's get started. He's going to talk for about 35 minutes, which will give us time for some questions and answers. So, Ashutosh, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Professor Kanchan Chandra yesterday gave you her indictment of India's democracy, and you'll hear my indictment today, but it's formulated very differently. It's heavily anchored in democratic theory. So let me start with a summary. It's a 35-minute lecture, so I could basically summarize what is the key elements of modern democratic theory. I will go back all the way back to John Stuart Mill for some of the arguments, to arguments produced in the 1860s, but most of democratic theory has been, the empirical democratic theory has been constructed after the Second World War, which will be the main anchorage site for my presentation. So the minimum requirement, according to modern democratic theory, for a democracy is electoral, and it has two dimensions: free contestation of the incumbents, the government, and participation, as close to universal participation as possible in elections. There is a broader requirement which takes democracy beyond elections and talks about the functioning of the polity between elections and concentrates on liberal freedoms. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association. At least these three, the list could be made wider, but at least these three would appear on almost all theoretical accounts of what a liberal democracy means, right from Mill through Dahl. And you can actually add Ronnie Dworkin to this, though his formulation is slightly more complicated. There is an argument about income and democracy that has emerged. Democracies can be established at low levels of income, which was not expected earlier, and Mill did not expect that, but they survive at high levels of income. The mortality rate at low levels of income is very high. This is Lipset and Adam Przeworski. On who votes, the conventional wisdom that emerged from Sidney Verba and his colleagues was that the richer and the more educated voters vote much more than the poorer and the less educated. And finally, a point about not just democracy, but democratic survival, democratic consolidation, famous Huntingtonian point, Samuel Huntington's point, that unless you have two turnovers, that is to say incumbents losing elections and quietly leaving power, and then those who came to power after the incumbents lost, when they became incumbents and then they lost, and when they stepped out of power, until that happens, democratic consolidation has not begun. So these are the 5 ideas from a very broad literature, a very interesting literature that would govern my assessment of Indian democracy. On electoral vibrancy, here is some basic data. Since 1952, 16 national elections, 362 state elections after the last 5, some weeks back. Since 1992, 3 million local legislators also elected every 5 years, 1/3 women by law, in some states, half now, including Bihar. 1/3 is required by law. It could be, that's the minimum requirement. That's minimum. It's a floor. It's not the ceiling. Power has changed hands 8 times in Delhi and tens of times at the state level. Political scientists don't count turnovers at the state level anymore. That many turnovers have taken place, satisfying the Huntingtonian principle many times over. The Huntingtonian democratic consolidation principle, many times over. In 1952, 81 million votes were cast. In 2014, nearly 555 million votes were cast. Turnouts by now routinely in excess of 60%. Until 1989, following mainstream democratic theory, the richer and more educated citizens used to vote more than the poorer and the less educated. Since 1989, defying democratic theory, the poor and the less educated have voted as much as, if not more than, their more fortunate co-citizens. In this electoral story, election finance is the single biggest weakness. But it's also clear that while businesses finance elections, often illegally, they are unable to determine election outcomes. Poorer political parties can win and have won. For example, Aam Aadmi Party in 2013 and 2015, SP in UP 2012, BSP in UP in 2007. It is not the case that the most well-financed parties always win in India. So the extent to which business can control election outcomes remains open. It remains open. I'll say more about this a little later. That's the summary of the electoral vibrancy. Here is a summary of liberal deficits before I expand on these points. As I said, the standard liberal freedoms on all theoretical templates are standard liberal freedoms on all democratic theory templates are freedom of expression, freedom of religious practice, and freedom of association. These freedoms important for democracy between elections. That's the important point here. Without these freedoms, a democracy between elections, however vibrant it is during elections, is weak between elections. But India's record on these freedoms is not as strong as its electoral record. These freedoms, though not absent, are not robustly anchored. Threats repeatedly appear, especially true at the present time. Okay, so that's the summary what I have to say. Let's now elaborate on these points. So the electoral record is theoretically surprising. As I said, a key article of theoretical faith now draws a distinction between establishment and resilience. Democracies can be established at low levels of income, but they survive primarily at high levels of income. In the West, universal franchise was introduced only after societies became rich, roughly around 19 teens. And in Switzerland as late as 1960s. India turns out to be On empirical and historical investigation, the longest surviving lower income universal franchise democracy in history, it has become lower middle income only in the last 10 years. It's categorized by the World Bank as an LMIC now, lower middle income country. It's no longer low income, over the last 10 years. But still, even at that level, no democracy has survived. Since 1952, as we know, only 18 months of national democratic suspension. Plus, there are regional democratic suspensions in areas of insurgency, but if you count how many people were directly affected by regional suspensions during insurgencies, the worst point was 1990, when Punjab insurgency had not died out, and Kashmir insurgency had burst forth. And even at that time, if you calculate how much of India was directly affected by the regional suspension of democracy, it was only 5%, not more than that. On the income yardstick, Adam Przeworski, Kachin's colleague, has redefined our understanding. There is some critique of what he's done, but what he's done is so massively significant that it bears attention. His data set covered 141 countries between 1950 and 1990. Income turned out to be the best predictor of democracy. It correctly predicted the type of regime in 77.5% of the cases. Only in 22.5% it did not. No other predictor. Religion. Islam was especially tested there. No other predictor. Religion, colonial legacy, ethnic diversity, international political environment is as good as income on the whole. India obviously is in the latter 22.5% set. Indeed, if we consider only decolonized countries, democracies that emerged from decolonization survived only in India, Mauritius, Belize, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. That is the list of the post-colonial democracies that lasted long. The most surprising case, argues Przeworski, is India. Quote, the odds against democracy in India were extremely high, unquote, and he jokingly once said if we could say there were negative odds, there's nothing called negative odds, can't be below zero. He said if we could think of, conceptualize something called negative odds, negative probability, then India would belong to that, given the conditions. Some other countries, we should note, have defied the pattern on the obverse side. If India is the biggest exception on the low income end, Singapore is the greatest surprise on the high income side. Singapore's per capita income has reached $53,000. It's richer than Britain, it's richer than France, it's richer than Germany. And it's the only non-oil rich country of the world which is not democratic. The only non-oil rich. Okay. Now, I wish to retrieve an older theoretical idea and add that to the income argument about democracy, which can be summarized as no wealth, no democracy. There is an older argument about the relationship between nationalism and democracy, or nationhood and democracy, that I wish to recover, retrieve, and present here, and have presented in my more recent work. As far back as John Stuart Mill, the argument then began about that time, the 1860s, lasted till the early decades of the 20th century, and then disappeared after the war, Second World War, but it needs to be retrieved, and I hope to convince you it's a very important point. With its rampant social diversity, this older theoretical argument said, India was unlikely to be a nation and therefore unlikely to be a democracy. No nation, no democracy is the summary of that argument. Here is the first statement of this theoretical proposition. John Stuart Mill. Free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities, among the people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages. The united public opinion necessary to the working of representative government cannot exist. This is basically the idea in modern social science language that Elections are about choosing governments. Elections are not about choosing nations. If elections are turned into referenda every 5 years, then elections would collapse. They would be bloody. A referendum is an occasional political device. Elections are a regular political device, and elections cannot be turned into referenda. System cannot work. It will collapse. This is basically in modern social science language, the John Stuart Mill idea. Then Mill goes on to argue in 1860s that of the colonies, British colonies, India, when the British left, if they did, would not be a nation. Would not be a nation. Then the Mill argument became extremely important. They had the highest levels of power in British India. Here is the famous John Strachey argument. Quote, there is not, never was in India, or even any country of India, possessing, according to any European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious, and that men of the Punjab, Bengal, the northwestern provinces, and Madras should ever feel that they belong to one Indian nation is impossible. You might, with as much reason and probability, look forward to a time when a single nation will have taken the place of the various nations of Europe, unquote. I propose to you, I suggest to you that this is not a cheap dismissal of Indian prospects. This is a profound idea. Conceptually, this draws a distinction between a civilization and a nation. It basically says that Europe is a civilization consisting of 20-odd nations, and India, once the British left, would be like Europe, a civilization which might have 28 nations, all built around languages, right? So we have 28 odd states now, they would be nations, right? That's the argument. India is a civilization, not a nation. A civilization is a cultural construct. A nation is a political cultural construct, not simply a cultural construct. As Gellner used to argue, a nation is equal to building a political roof over your cultural head. It's a very, very, very interesting formulation of Gellner. It's a very, very, very good one that Gellner proposed. A nation is like building a political roof over your cultural head. Without that political roof, you are a cultural entity, a civilizational entity, not a national entity. Here's Mark Twain, one of the literary giants of the 19th century, traveling in India for 6 months and writing the following in 1896 he traveled, 1899 the book came out. India had the first civilization. She had the first accumulation of material wealth. She was populous with deep thinkers and subtle intellects. She had mines and woods and fruitful soil. It would seem as if she should have kept lead and should be today not the meek dependent of an alien master. If there had been but one India and one language, but there were 80 of them, where there are 80 nations and several hundred governments, fighting and quarreling must be the common business of life. Unity of purpose and policy are impossible. Patriotism can have no healthy growth. It's the same idea, but presented in a literary form by a literary giant of 19th century. An American traveling and getting to know India, which was very unusual, rather unusual at that time. Here is, according to me, Mahatma Gandhi's response. It's not that he had read John Stuart Mill very carefully, but he understood intuitively what the problem was. And Gandhi, to use today's language, proposed that Indians would have a hyphenated identity. That Indians would be Gujarati Indians, Bengali Indians, Tamil Indians, and that India would have to de-link language and nationhood. And the idea of imposing a European concept of nation on India would not generate a nation, but would break up India completely. So a new sort of nation was necessary, and that nation would rely on delinking language and nationhood, and will rely on creating dual identities, as opposed to a singular national identity. Hind Swaraj, there are some truly remarkable, if you think of the Althusserian idea of epistemological break, which he uses for Marx, early Marx and later Marx, And the epistemological break comes after which work of Marx? I think it's about 1860 or so, argues Althusser there's epistemological break. In Gandhi, the epistemological break is around 1901, 1902, 1903. For example, he doesn't use the term coolie for blacks of South Africa after that. He's evolving politically, but he's coming up with a conception of India by 1905, and then you have Hind Swaraj laying out the vision, where he argues that even English would be acceptable as an Indian language. The idea of imposing Hindi does not, even English would be acceptable as an Indian language. I do not, this famous statement he made, this is much later, this statement, I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all the lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any. So this would be called today, in today's political theory, cosmopolitan rootedness. I'm rooted, but I'm also cosmopolitan at the same time. And even not only the English language, even the English did not have to leave. Now this is straight from Hind Swaraj. I do not want my house to be walled is actually 1919. But 1907, he makes the case, it's not necessary for us to have as our goal the expulsion of the English. If the English become Indianized, we can accommodate them. Right? So this, of course, he dealings religion and nationhood also, but religion and nationhood, that was not the European concept of nationhood. European concept of nationhood relied heavily on language. Gandhi, of course, proposes a delink of religion and nationhood also because that had started becoming a contentious point in Indian political debates, not because it was a contentious point in European debates. One should, of course, note that Gandhi was ambivalent about democracy, but the theoretically necessary point for us here is the creation of a nation with this new conception, new imagination, this new political imagined community, which would de-link language and nationhood and develop a cosmopolitan understanding of nationhood. This created the foundations of democracy in India, but that took India from a civilization to a nation. Not a fully successful one, after all Pakistan broke away. Not a fully successful one, but a substantial success, if not a full success. And that Tamil Nadu and UP and Gujarat and Bengal all could come together and could get to the Constituent Assembly and could debate ideas and create a constitution is a major historical occurrence. Europe has not been able to create a nation, and it's perhaps coming apart. Even the community that was created is perhaps coming apart now. Liberal deficits, liberal freedoms. India is freest at the time of elections. Short of inciting violence, virtually any argument can be made in election campaigns. But once an elected government takes over, restrictions on basic liberal liberties are often placed. Intellectuals, writers, students, non-governmental organizations can face harassment on grounds that they hurt the sentiments of certain groups or undermine national interest. In a multi-religious society which has also had a deeply hierarchical system for centuries, some group or the other can always claim to be heard. When group injury is claimed, governments rarely support the writer, rarely support the intellectual, rarely support the artist, rarely support the NGO. This is not simply a BJP problem. This has been common to all kinds of government. Book bans quite frequent. Rushdie's satanic verses was banned by the Congress because of Muslim right. Also on this Congress party, M.F. Hussain, India's leading painter after, arguably, had to migrate because of Hindu right. But these problems, of course, become especially serious when Hindu nationalists come to power, as is true today, because minorities automatically get added to the list of targets, not simply writers and artists. A Hindu-centric view of the nation leads to that. India for Hindu nationalists is a Hindu nation, which is a fundamentally unconstitutional idea. I went to a remarkable talk 3 evenings ago, in Delhi, where Fali Nariman, a great legal mind of India, spoke about threats to the constitution now. And while the The Constitution did not say until the emergency that it was a secular constitution, and it's in the preamble now after that. It didn't, that's how Constituent Assembly structured it, but that's the spirit of the Constitution. That it's not, it's a secular nation, and Hindus are neither the exclusive nor the primary owners of the nation. The nation is owned by all communities. Second, a muscular nationalism threatening to exclude dissenters also comes into being. This includes people who live abroad, like me, Indians who live abroad and write. Threats regularly arrive, from powers that be. Now, as for the liberal retrenchment since the rise of Modi, consider 3 examples. More can be added: Ghar Wapsi, Dadri lynching, and Bharat Mata campaign, and the use of sedition law against a student leader who was simply present in a conference or in a seminar where Kashmir was discussed, and some people said Kashmir should break away from India. Under liberal freedoms, that is allowed so long as a violent mobilization is not launched. If a violent mobilization is launched, no modern nation would tolerate that. It's not only India. No modern nation would tolerate a violent secessionary impulse. The Weberian concept of modern nationhood, modern nation states would exclude that idea. That is one thing. Only the state has legitimate monopoly over violence and coercion in principle. Now, consider the role of courts here. Ultimately, courts are the final protectors of freedom. That is part of liberal political theory. Constitutions and courts protect citizen freedoms. Legislatures and executives encroach upon freedoms often by exercising power in a way that may be not very constitutionally governed. Courts in India have overturned government decisions repeatedly, but the problem is simple. The executive has the upper hand in the short to medium run. Courts take long to decide. Therefore, if you are harassed by the government, your freedom is taken away, you have to consider a long court case, which can be prohibitively expensive, and there could be other costs associated with that, not simply finances, right? And meanwhile, your liberties are taken away. So, in the short to medium run, the executive has an upper hand over the courts, even if courts do end up protecting citizen freedoms, which Indian courts have repeatedly done. Whether they will continue to do so if Hindu nationalists remain in power, and if they remain not only in power in Delhi but also in Lucknow, no political scientists would disagree with the fact that empirically speaking, not in principle and not normatively, that empirically speaking, the second most powerful office of India is Lucknow after Delhi. This is an empirical statement. This is not a normatively defensible statement, right? All states are equal, but in terms of apportionment of power, distribution of power, a state that has 80 seats in parliament, its chief minister has to be seen as the second most powerful man in India after the Prime Minister of India. Now, arguably this is the case, we can argue about that, but even if you don't believe it's the second most important, it is one of the most important, most powerful offices in India. If you control Delhi as well as Lucknow, if the same party controls Delhi as well as Lucknow, then the power dynamics has a certain logic which can be easily spelled out. So whether the courts will continue to, so the challenge here is, will the courts of India give a Hindu nationalist interpretation of India's constitution? It's happened only once. Justice Verma did it, and he apologized actually later. And Justice Verma is a very highly respected jurist, very highly respected. Can the courts of India now begin to give a Hindu nationalist interpretation of the Constitution is a very important political and intellectual and legal question. So let me summarize. One of my mentors was Samuel Huntington at Harvard. He became infamous for his last 2 books, but the books he wrote before the last 2 books were masterpieces of political science. no doubt about that. In his very important work on American democracy, these are the last lines, very epigrammatic lines that he was, formulation that he was famous for. These are literally the last lines of his book on American democracy. Critics say that America is a lie because its reality falls so short of its ideals. They're wrong. America is not a lie, it's a disappointment. But it can be a disappointment only because it's also a hope, unquote. Is it simply a play with words, a play on words? No, there's actually a profound thought here. America, according to one interpretation, a major interpretation, not a minor boutique interpretation, no, a major interpretation, American nationhood is based on Declaration of Independence. Therefore, if that argument is a mainstream argument, it also implies that America is based on some political principles. It's not an ethnic nation. Protestants don't own it, whites don't own it. It's based on, there are the 5 principles in the Declaration of Independence, 2 of which have been widely noted: freedom and equality. But even when the Constitution was being made, which based upon the Declaration of Independence, even at that time, when these principles were being laid out into or inscribed into the Constitution, blacks were neither free nor equal. And slavery didn't end till 1864. And then after slavery ended, there were Jim Crow laws for a long time. And it's only in 1964, 65, mid-1960s, with the Voting Rights Act, with the Civil Rights Act, and later immigration reform, which allowed non-white communities to come in. There's a Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and there's an Asian Exclusion Act, not exactly these words, but in 1919. And all of that was overturned only in 1967. So between 1882 and 1967, only, the immigration into America was overwhelmingly white. And after 1967 is being overwhelmingly non-white. And by 2041, America will be a primarily non-white country. That's the prediction of demographers. Okay, the point here is that the commitment to equality and freedom, which defined the nation, continued to be either only partially met, but the claim also is that the gap between ideals and realities kept narrowing. And it narrowed to its lowest limit. It shrunk to its lowest limit by mid-1960s, which is perhaps the new regime is trying to overturn that. The post-1965 political order, the attempt of Trumpian majority, or Trumpian 46%, is to overturn the post-1965 order and get back to those contradictions again. India's democratic credentials are not in doubt, but the gap between India's ideals and India's realities, India's ideals as laid out in the Constitution, and India's realities, while narrower and narrower over the time, I'm not sure what assessment we'll have after 2014, we have to wait and see, kept narrowing, but the gap remains. But in any case, at India's level of income, no democracy has ever survived for 7 decades. But India has done much better as an electoral democracy, substantially less well as a liberal democracy. For a deepening of Indian democracy, there are 2 minimum requirements. You can make them larger, less larger. One, a more robust anchoring of liberal freedoms, about which I have talked, and reform of election finance. Whether the reform attempted on February 1st by Mr. Jaitley is a real reform or not, we can talk about that if you're interested in Q&A. Thank you. Shall I stand here?
Well, thank you, Tosh, for finishing on time. We do have some time for questions and answers, so why don't we start in? And I'm sure that Ashutosh's remarks generated many ideas that people would like to talk about. Okay, let's start in the...
Would you like me to go one by one, or would you collect? Should we collect three at a time?
Why don't we do 3 by 3?
Okay.
That'll give you a chance to reflect on how you'd like to answer. Okay, over here on the left. or you're right.
Ashu, this was a fantastic talk, and there's one area on which I'd like you to elaborate. You had limited time. When one talks about democratic evolution, how does one treat the use of coercive power by the state on its citizens as a benchmark for evolution of democracy and liberal freedom? Isn't this particularly important in India, because we've had since independence crack police, basically exploitative police, corrupt, exploitative, ineffective, and used. And then we've of course had internal movements, violent movements, and our ability to deal with political settlements has been limited. So how would this configure in your evaluation? Thanks.
Okay, let's go into the back, in the black shirt there, and then we'll come back to Meghna Desai. Yeah, in the black shirt.
Professor Varshney, we understand that Indian Constitution provides for recognition, accommodation, as well as representation of the minorities, the differences. I think that yesterday we also heard Professor Chandra, and you have been writing, we give too much emphasis on electoral democracy. And when you refer to contestation, level of contestation and level of participation, we also should think about the level of representation. And I think that you gave the example of UP. There has been a conscious effort and a very arrogant kind of stance that you can simply exclude the most numerous minority of India and you can manage to win the election. So what you have to say about our electoral system, which really, as per your reading, leads to deepening or widening, or at least widening of democracy. So Kanchan Chandra also spoke about deficit, but then the minority, it's a serious thing. Could you really imagine 10 years back that a party can win without getting the vote of the minority, but just like excluding them, not giving them even ticket? And it is possible, and there is a studied silence in India about it. So how do you respond to this?
Okay, thank you. Meghna Desai.
One observation, what you said about the American demographics, I was surprised because I have been looking at it myself. And if you look, depends on whether you treat Hispanics as white or non-white. But even currently, 77% are European whites and another 12% are Hispanic whites. Our black Americans have only been around about 10% for over 150 years. So unless the Asian breed, I don't know why should whites go a minority. But more than that, I just wanted to observe that when Gandhi said that if the English become Indian, they're all right. Well, he spoke for our first few prime ministers.
Can you say that again?
He spoke of our few first prime ministers.
That's an interesting thought. Ratan, if I understood you correctly, your question is can be decomposed into two parts: the use of coercive power by the state on its citizens, and violent movements, political movements in different parts of India. The second is very easily answerable. No modern nation state can accept in principle, even in principle, a violent political movement against the integrity of the state.
I mean, the failure to solve.
Right? Yeah. So now, what causes violent movements to emerge? It may be the misbehavior of the state, right? But no modern state can take a Maoist challenge or an assembly. You can say that's a fundamental problem of modern nation state, but that's what by definition it is, right? And legally, constitutionally, and otherwise, that challenge will have to be dealt with in a coercive way. That is different from now. In principle, you could still India, the way India has dealt with the violent political movements, India has not dealt with them in the Indonesian way. India uses coercion, as all modern states do, against violent movements, but it also opens a political channel for conversation. Right? It operates on, and then the third, it tries to throw economic resources into that state to buy off the elite of the violent movement, and perhaps undermine, or perhaps either buy off the elite or undermine the base of the elite by creating roads and creating this and creating that. Right? So it's been a threefold strategy that Indian state has had, some variation around these three dimensions. Right? But Indian state has not used only coercion against violent political movements. Right? Which is not how Indonesia dealt with East Timor. Okay. Use of coercive power against citizens is a violation of the liberal spirit of the fundamental principles of liberal democracy. Even demonetization was a violation of the liberal principles of a democracy. You can't withdraw money like that. You have to give. You may want to withdraw money. You may want to demonetize. Monetary policy does not go through popular referenda. Monetary policy is with the government. We know that. An instant withdrawal as opposed to a prior warning, right? A prior warning would be consistent with liberal principles of democracy, but not an instant withdrawal of 86% of the money, right? So all of those are violent, and it turns out that it didn't hurt him, demonetization, but it cannot be called a democratic move. Simply cannot. You may find other justifications for it, but not on liberal grounds you can justify that, right? Ashutosh, your point about, yes, my presentation was heavily reliant on mainstream democratic theory, which in turn is heavily reliant on contestation and participation as the election principle, but not, it doesn't talk much, I mean, between elections is to be added to that. That comes from political theory. The idea of liberal freedoms. That is not just an empirical argument, right? It comes from normative political theory. Kanchan's indictment of Indian democracy yesterday was based on India's representational contradictions, paradoxes, deficits. I'm saying that a judgment about Indian democracy is actually in a multivariate analytic space, where you'll have to use several dimensions and figure out on which dimension it is doing well, on which dimension it's not doing well, and representation would be one such dimension, right? Would be one such dimension. But I don't think we can overburden that dimension in our overall assessment. Yeah, it is a multivariate analytic space. There are multiple variables involved, and you can certainly identify three that you have. But this question of liberal freedoms is the fourth that you can add to it, right? So this is how I would mount my indictment, going through all of these dimensions, and then if I find deficits, right? But I won't hook it entirely on representation. I do believe it's a very important point that Kanchan made yesterday about India's representational deficits. Yeah, okay. Meghnad,
asking you about like electoral democracy in some way threatening the
the point about minorities, yes, of course, in India's constitution, the reason democracies have constitution, as the wonderful legal theory, political theory, branches of legal and political theory say, the reason democracies have constitutions is because democracies have a tendency to become majoritarian. Constitutions are what protect minorities, right? If you simply let the electoral logic roll, the majorities would overwhelm minorities. The Constitution protects them, right? Or some kind of political electoral calculation might also protect, right? Now, of course, the big paradox of UP, or the most surprising empirical paradox of UP to 2014 and 2017 is that it's not Gujarat. It's not 9%, Gujarat is only 9% Muslim. UP is 20% Muslim. So the strategy that BJP had in 2014 as well in 2017 is a very Trumpian strategy. So Obama won two presidential elections on the basis of the following principle. If I win 80% of non-white vote, which is 30% of the overall vote, and I only win 38-39% of white vote, I will still win presidency of America. 70% is white, 30% is non-white. Actually, it's slightly more complex. That's demographic, but I can get into the details of it. I've studied this now for some time. But that's the sort of back of envelope principle. Trump's strategy said, we don't need minority vote, non-white vote. All we need is 70% of 70% to get to 50%. Or that's all we need. So if we have white consolidation, right, then the minority vote or non-white vote is just a bonus, right? Here is what BJP did in 2014, 2017 in UP. They said, all right, Muslims 20%. Jatav, you exclude Muslims, Jatav, Dalits, and Yadav OBCs, you're left with 60% of UP. All we need in a trilateral space. Not in a straight contest. In a straight contest, you would need about 50%. In a trilateral contest, all we need is 70% of 60%. Right? And 70% of 60% you can get through upper caste, non-Yadav OBCs, and non-Jatav Dalits. 70% of that wins you the election. And in a big way. This is like white consolidation. This is Hindu consolidation. This is if this stabilizes. In 2019, one more round, we have the beginnings of Gujarat 2.0 in UP. Absolutely. Even though Muslims are 20% of UP. And so this is a very remarkable achievement from BJP's perspective, clearly, and a very surprising achievement from the perspective of all those of us who analyze and who might not support BJP. This is a remarkable development. 70% of 60% generating, seeming to stabilize at this point. We need to watch two more times, but 2019, if it repeats itself, that would be the beginning of Gujarat 2.0 in UP. And if BJP maintains this stabilizes around 40%, it can be in power in UP for 10 to 20 years, and that would be a much bigger development politically than 20 years of BJP in Gujarat and 30 years of Communist Party in West Bengal. Okay. So yes, I hope that answers. Meghna, the way the data, Hispanics are not considered white. That solves the problem, right? So Hispanics are 18%, 12% blacks, Asians, I think 4% now, but very fast-growing population. And so that's 18 plus 12, 30 plus 4, 34. Demographically, it's 34%, 36% non-white, not demographically. But in electoral way, the reason, since you asked this question, electorally, United States is 72% white and 28% non-white, because a lot of poor Hispanics and poor blacks are unable to register. So the demographic and the electoral have a gap. But the demographic projection, because Hispanics are not whites, demographic projection is by 2041, and by that time, by the 2040 census, America would be roughly 48-49% white. Yes. And yes, I accept your wonderful reference to Nehru as becoming Indianized, as the Anglo in India becoming Indianized.
We were a little late getting started, so we can probably squeeze out 3 more questions, but I'd have to ask you, no speeches, please. Short questions only, and we'll take 3. So we'll start in the very back there on the left, then come down to the front, and then one more in the back.
Gujarat 2.0. Gujarat 1.0 was what we've seen in Gujarat. over the last 20 years, which is BJP dominating the political space with roughly 48 to 50% of vote, right? And that in a trilateral space, you can generate that with 40%.
Okay, we should be moving on because we've got
Okay,
another talk
here's the
coming up.
question.
So your
Professor
turn, sir.
Varshney, thank you very much for a masterful presentation.
Thank you.
We've all read your works and you didn't disappoint us today.
Thank you.
I have a two-part question. One is the nationalism which is currently sweeping the country here, and you've confirmed it today, is in broad parts violative of the Indian Constitution. If so, why has there not been any challenge to elected chief executives of states on the oath they have taken for upholding the Constitution? Because it's not only in 2014 that we had a prime minister, we have had chief executives in the states from this party earlier also. And the second part of the question is, if the space of the Constitution defending the civil liberties or liberties is slipping, is it time to add to your minimum requirements, doing away with first past the post system so that a more representative democracy can be established in the country? Thank you.
Okay, down in the front. Yeah, you, sir. No?
Thank you. When the Constitution was made, I think there were three basic tenets in that Constitution. One was democracy, second was secularism, and the third one was added later, socialism. The third one has been abandoned. Second one is highly threatened. And it's under these circumstances that you're talking about. The probability of democracy in India is probably a negative probability. If an event is happening, in spite of a negative probability, I fear it is not the event that you're talking about, but it's an illusory event. The event, the democracy that you're talking about has survived 7 decades. It's not the democracy that you normally think in our literature or research. It's an illusory event, and it is our business to find out what is the character of this illusion and what are the determinants of this illusory event. This is the.
And one more over here on the left.
The lady.
Right there. Yeah.
Well, you partially answered one of my questions, but just talking about nationalism as a process, I think we all know that it is an exclusivist process, and by its definition, if we see, then where does the Indian nation go? Characterized by its plurality, and if we acknowledge the right to self-determination by various communities, and the kind of majoritarianism that we have seen in the last 2 elections, how do you actually reconcile the aspirations of other communities and democratic aspirations, a space in the Indian nation, and then the future of this last bastions of a plural society?
Sorry. Every time a Hindu nationalist comes to power in India, but we should note first of all what is very distinctive and politically and legally and constitutionally alarming about UP, what has happened in UP. For the first time in India's post-47 history, someone who heads a religious order is now heading the state. For literally the first time. That Hindu nationalists have been in power quite a lot, at the state level certainly, now also in Delhi, but at no point during their growth has the head of a religious order based in a mutt also become the head of the state, of a state, head of a state. It is probably, and he has taken an oath to serve India's constitution. Now, that is a generic issue. Every time a Hindu nationalist comes to power, he or she works under 3 principles. One is constitutional, that cannot be just wished away. Once you run a government, it can't just be wished away. Second is ideological, the view that India is a Hindu nation, which is fundamentally unconstitutional unless the judiciary approves that idea in some new interpretation. And third is electoral, how far to push the idea of Hindu nationalism. You also calculate whether it would win you elections or not, right? So all Hindu nationalist governments function under these three impulses. They don't go in the same direction, right? Now, please note that whatever Mr. Modi did in Gujarat, he has not, since taking over as Prime Minister, said India is a Hindu nation. He has not said that. And please also note that he has said, you may not believe him. You may say that there is a duplicity here. I mean, Pratap Mehta recently talked about duplicity of Hindu nationalism, especially illustrated in the selection of Yogi Adityanath as UP's chief minister. But he's not said that, and he's also not said, Sushma Swaraj might have said, India's prime minister, Hindu nationalist prime minister, has not said that Gita is the most sacred document of India. He has repeatedly said the constitution is a sacred document, right? The office brings that necessity in, right? Now, whether or not they have delivered on that oath and whether they can be taken to the court, it's for citizens to decide, it's political organizations to decide, NGOs to decide. But if NGOs and citizens are afraid of the power of government, especially Hindu nationalist government, then very few would have the courage to go to the court and ask whether the government is following all the RSS, which is not a religious organization. It is not a religious order. He is not a Mahant, right? He's not a yogi. Well, he is a yogi, but he's not a Mahant. So this is in UP it's going to be tested. All of us are watching what Yogi Adityanath would say and would do. What the foot soldiers do, you can, legally that's a different kind of issue. Yes, the presence of the arrival of Yogi Adityanath as Chief Minister of UP would create an enabling environment for the foot soldiers. That's always true in politics. The arrival of Trump has created an enabling environment for the foot soldiers who can look at an Indian American and think he's Arab and kill him, right? So this is very consistent with how politics operates. But whether he himself, the yogi himself, will say and do things that are unconstitutional, we are all watching. And then the next question is, who will challenge him in court? Right? Who will challenge him in court? And how long would the court take to decide whether a government is doing things that are unconstitutional? Right? So that's a very good question. First past the post, we don't have enough time. This is a very complicated question, whether we should have first past the post or proportional representation. Something like 1/4 of political scientists have dealt with it. Maybe not 1/4, a very substantial number have dealt with this question. And only political science handles first past the post versus PR, right? And consociational versus liberal and all that. This is our comparative advantage in the discipline, right? And it's very boring stuff, actually. It's really boring stuff, these institutional questions, but they are very important issues. They're boring but important. I don't support PR in India. I think first past the post with protection for minorities, constitutional protection for minorities, is a good enough principle. PR has lots of difficulties, which we don't have time for. I don't believe, sir, that India's democracy is illusory. I don't believe so. I think India's democracy has many deficits, but those deficits do not fully undermine the claim that India's elections are free and fair. You may not like the verdict that emerged in UP, but it was not coerced out. It was not manipulated. It was not. People went to the voting booth and freely and voted freely. And it so happens that 39.7% of UP's electorate voted for BJP. Right? You may not like it, but it was not coerced out of people. So I don't think it's illusion. Nationalism is exclusive. Some brands of nationalism are exclusive. But to say that nationalism, by definition, it would include some and it would exclude some. So, yes, even Gandhi, when he said the English are can be included, didn't say everybody in the world can be included, right? And if everybody in the world can be included, they will have to be Indianized. Use the term, if they Indianize themselves or respect our culture, then the English don't have to leave, they can be part of India, right? So there is a requirement for nationhood, which would exclude some. However, nationhood, this imagined political community, the wonderful phrase that Benedict Anderson proposed to us and all of us accepted, this imagined political community can be restrictively imagined and expansively imagined. Gandhi's imagination about the nation is expansive. Hindu nationalist imagination about the nation is restrictive. Right? But nationalism by itself is not necessarily unduly restrictive. It would have some restrictions because it needs some boundaries. Done?
Are you done?
I'm done.
Oh, good. Okay. Then I think it's time to wind up. I might take just a moment to include a personal note here that in 1961, I was inducted into the U.S. Army, like so many other people, as a second lieutenant, and I took an oath of office. And the oath of office was not to the president, it was not to the commander-in-chief, it was to uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States. And that, if nothing else, is perhaps the ultimate guarantee that the Constitution will prevail in the United States. And I think the same could be said about India, and will serve India if things should come to that. So with that, let me wind up here. I thank Ashutosh for his presentation. And we're ready to move on to the next panel.
Thank you.